Public finance works on the assumption that government is benevolent. Government tries to maximize social welfare. And the entire literature on public finance is based on this assumption, based on this foundation. And the assumption in public choice is that governments are not benevolent. They are what we call self-aggrandizing leviathan. Students of political science can understand this expression. Governments are self-serving, ensuring welfare of people is not their primary goal. Primary goal is to win elections and retain in power. The domain of welfare economics is primarily concerned with economic well-being of individuals, economic well-being of society. It is also concerned with allocation and distribution of resources. Who gets what, why, and at what cost? This is the primary question in welfare economics. And this question appears to be very economic on surface, but it is also deeply political and philosophical. When economists talk about welfare economics, they talk about utility functions, efficiency, resource distribution. In political science, we talk about politics of welfare, where we deal with ethics, morality, dignity, rights, and justice. In welfare economics, there are certain principles based on which the benchmarks of welfarism are established, which means how can you say that a particular state is a welfare state? How can you ensure that the action or the policies designed by the government are welfare enhancing? So there are certain foundational principles. There are certain criteria. One is, which is very famous, and it is called Pareto optimality, named after Wilfredo Pareto. And the condition for optimality is that a policy is optimal if it makes someone better off without making anyone else worse off. So far as a particular policy can improve someone's life without harming anyone else's life, you can go out, you can contact. But actually, in the real world, things are different. In real world, it is impossible to have a policy where some people gain but nobody loses. For example, when a highway is built, it passes through someone else's field. When a dam is built, it may displace many people. When tax break is given to industrialists, it may reduce subsidies for poor people. So whenever a policy is implemented or a policy is changed, there are trade-offs. Some gain and some lose. Now this was a dilemma. And in order to address this dilemma, two British economists, Nicholas Caldor and John Hicks, developed compensation criteria, which says that if a policy leads to economic gains, which are bigger and larger than the losses, then we can say an improvement has been made, provided in theory those people, those sections who lose because of that policy can be compensated by those who gain. But again, in real life, this is not very practical. This is not possible. Compensations are generally never given. People lose their homes, people lose their lands, people lose their livelihood, but either they get nothing or very little in return. Now we turn the page into political theory. Political theory expands the idea of welfare from economic efficiency to human happiness, from economic efficiency to justice for all. So there is a utilitarian social welfare function. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, they make a very simple and sweeping goal. The goal of any policy should be greatest happiness of greatest numbers. This sounds very appealing. This sounds very elegant. But if you go deep, then this principle of greatest happiness of greatest numbers overlooks rights and sufferings of minorities. And the rights and sufferings of minorities are sacrificed in the pursuit of happiness and satisfaction of the majority. So therefore, this principle also fails the test of justice and fairness. So in 1971, political thinker and philosopher John Rawls wrote a book, A Theory of Justice. So Rawlsian social welfare function is also very important in political science. John Rawls changed the way we think about fairness. He says we can judge a society not by its total wealth. We should not judge a society by how many people are rich, but how it treats those who are at the bottom. How the society treats those who are most vulnerable, who are poor, poorest of the poor, and those who are the weakest. But John Rawls also invites some criticism because his philosophy is too focused on the poorest in the society. His philosophy is too focused on the vulnerable sections of the society. And if a policy is so designed, then it is possible that it would be very costly to some other or rest of the groups in the society. And the prescription of John Rawls is that the policy should give greatest benefit to the least advantaged sections of the society, and it is very difficult and impractical to devise such policies all the time. So, the search for better welfare principles continues. Amartya Sen, in 1999, wrote a book, Development as Freedom, where he developed the concept of capability approach, where he says that development should be assessed not by per capita income, but by the expansion of people's capabilities, not by economic growth, but by expansion of people's freedom, people's ability, people's capability to live the kind of life they want to live. Amartya Sen says that the principles of utility, principles of satisfaction or happiness of the majority or people as an index of progress can be misleading. It can be misleading because people can adjust to deprivations. If a starving person has learned not to complain, if a hungry person, starving person has learned to suppress his suffering, and he is always reporting satisfaction and happiness, can we honestly treat this silence as a sign of satisfaction and this silence as sign of his well-being? So he says that we should evaluate a society not by income, not by the reported levels of satisfaction or happiness, but by the range of capabilities. Range of capabilities and opportunities available to the individuals. Their freedom to pursue their aspirations, their freedom to live with dignity, their freedom to live the life of their dream and the life that they value. So if we look deep, the dilemma here is of trade-off between efficiency and equity. Economists generally focus more on the efficiency part. Political scientists generally focus more on the equity part, but actually in the domain of political economy, this trade-off is a very important subject. And the trade-off is that some believe that economic efficiency and economic growth should come first. Once there is economic growth, then over a period of time, all these sections of society will benefit, and equity will be ensured. And then there is another school of thought where they say that first of all, you ensure equity, fairness in the system, justice in the system. And once equity is ensured, efficiency will follow. And as you can say, these are the contrasting opinions, and there is a trade off. And this trade off was famously captured by Arthur Okun in his 1975 classic Equity and Efficiency, the Big Trade Off. This is the title of the book. He says redistribution in order to ensure equity is like carrying a bucket full of water that leaks, which means that some of it gets lost along the way due to inefficiencies, due to corruption. As Rajiv Gandhi famously said, that out of 1 rupee earmarked for social welfare, only 15 paise reach the intended beneficiaries. The rest of it is lost in the process because of inefficiencies, systemic inefficiencies, and corruption. However, we need both. We need efficiency, we need economic growth. At the same time, we need equity, we need justice. So the question is how to maximize output. How to maximize output with available resources. How to maximize output even in the context of scarcity of resources, and then distribute that output based on the principles of justice. But the challenge here is that there is no natural flow from efficiency to equity. Extensive empirical research in economics has shown that there is no evidence of what they call trickle-down effect. Trickle-down effect is a belief that benefits of economic growth will eventually reach everyone. Empirical studies conducted by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, also show that inequality in the society can increase even when GDP is growing. Economic growth is happening, but at the same time, simultaneously, inequalities are also expanding. GDP is expanding, inequalities are also expanding. Oxfam India in 2023 prepared a report with a very interesting title: Survival of the Richest. You have heard Darwin's theory, survival of the fittest. So this is wordplay on that title, Survival of the Richest, where they show the extent of wealth disparities in India. Only 10% of people hold 72% of wealth. 5% of people hold 60% of wealth. And only 1% of people, top 1% of people hold 40% of wealth. And the bottom 50% hold only 3% of the total wealth. So therefore, economic growth and economic efficiency does not automatically lead to equality or equity. IMF research also shows that redistribution has no statistically significant negative correlation with economic growth, which means redistribution does not harm economic growth. But at the same time, they have found that inequality has statistically significant correlation with economic growth, which means inequality can harm economic growth. Therefore, redistribution is required. It is required because it can enhance efficiency. How it can enhance efficiency? Obviously, the assumption is that the redistribution itself would be efficient, assuming there is no leakage, assuming there is no corruption. Then this kind of redistribution can expand human capital because of the investment in education and health. And it can increase poor people's access to market. And it also increases efficiency by preventing social discontent and by reducing social conflict. When we talk about equity, the goal is not equality of outcomes. We are not trying to achieve equality of outcomes. But what we are trying to achieve is equality of opportunity. Every individual, all sections of society should have fair opportunity to compete and achieve their goals and objectives in their life. So the equity principle is that if people have similar needs, if people have similar abilities, then they should be treated as same. And if they have different needs, different challenges, different situations, for instance, persons with disability, someone who has been displaced because of floods, because of natural calamities, someone who is living in extreme poverty, someone who is historically underprivileged, either because of social hierarchies or socio-economic backgrounds, they should be treated differently. So goal is not to make sure that everyone ends up with the same result, but to make sure that everyone gets a fair chance, gets a fair opportunity. Now, how can we ensure that? Whether markets will ensure or state will ensure. Markets only invest where there is profit. Even if there is high social cost, they will invest even in those fields where there is profit, even if there is social cost. And it also ignores the areas where there is no profit, even if there is very high social benefit. For instance, clean air, street lighting, public sanitation, vaccination, free or affordable education, affordable healthcare. Private markets will not provide them fairly or affordably. So therefore, government must step in. Government must provide or invest in these areas where there is low private profit but high social benefit. Now, how should government provide wealth? There are two approaches. One is the benevolent approach, the paternalistic approach, that the government designs certain schemes, and those schemes are named after people who are in the ruling party in order to establish their benevolence. But the problem with this kind of approach is that these welfare policies are discretionary. Discretionary means the government can reduce them anytime, can take them back. Politicians or political officials or even bureaucrats can use it for rent seeking, can increase corruption. Then there can be exclusion errors, which means leaving out those who deserve, and inclusion errors, which means benefiting those who do not deserve, who are not eligible. So this brings us to the second approach, which is the rights-based approach. Right-based approach is considered to be fair because in this case, welfare is not charity. Welfare becomes your right, and the government is duty bound to deliver your rights. In this approach, welfare does not create dependency narrative, but it enhances dignity. Because you know that what you are getting is not a gift, but it is your right. So it enhances dignity and it enhances democratic citizenship. And this brings us to the case of India, where India stands. First of all, I would say that India faces structural constraints. India faces structural challenges. In European welfare states, redistribution works because a very large percentage of people pay taxes. And there is social consensus on welfare. People support welfare. In India, the problem is, as the data released by Central Board of Direct Taxes shows, only 2% of people pay income tax. All welfare is to be funded by taxpayers' money. There are no taxpayers. Only 2% of people pay income tax. To make things work, a lot of this welfare never reaches its intended beneficiary. Most of it leaks out in corruption and systemic inefficiencies. Having said this, I would also say that in the Indian context, particularly following the economic reforms of 1991, that was the economic thinking of those who designed the policies of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. You might have heard of the term economic growth with human face, which means efficiency plus equity. Efforts were made despite all the resource constraints. So, after economic reforms, we see that there is a perceptible shift from benevolent top-down approach, which was very clearly visible during the one dominant party era of Congress, towards a right-based framework in welfare policy. Most importantly, this transition was spearheaded by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court made expansive interpretations of Article 21. which guarantees a right to life. In 1993, Supreme Court held that right to education is implicit in Article 21. This led to 86th Amendment making education a fundamental right. In 1996, Supreme Court recognized the right to health as an integral part of right to life. In 2001, Supreme Court acknowledged right to food security as fundamental right under Article 21. These judicial pronouncements have prompted successive governments to operationalize the right-based approach. Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005 exemplifies this transformation, which emphasizes right to work. Forest Rights Act 2006, it recognizes the rights of forest-dwelling communities over their own land and resources. Right to Education Act 2009, it transformed education into justiciable right. National Food Security Act 2013 further reinforces this right-based approach, which is a framework for implementation of public distribution scheme, midday meal scheme, and many other food security schemes like that. So finally, in conclusion, I would say that India's welfare story may not be perfect, but it is powerful. The genius of Indian economic thinking is that it shows that efficiency and equity are not enemies, but efficiency and equity can also be partners. Indian economic thinking has shown that in addition to roads, in addition to infrastructure, in addition to GDP, in addition to income, it is also about education. It is also about health, it is also about dignity, it is also about rights. It is not just about subsistence, but real empowerment and real capability to shape one's own future.